Good morning, Professor Spooner. How are you today?
Good morning, Frank. I'm fine, thanks. I hope you are too.
Thank you.
I've been thinking this week about the various things about globalization, which I think never get discussed because um, social science pays so little attention to social processes. There's been much more, I mean, sociologists I use statistical methods most of the time, and anthropologists who in this country call themselves cultural anthropologists spend all their time uh, trying to understand culture and the way culture changes,
Hmm.
paying no attention or pretty much no attention to the fact that culture is a product of social situations. And if you want to understand how culture changes, then you've got to understand how, in what way culture is embedded in social processes and what exactly makes those social processes change and how their change influences culture and changes it. So the biggest thing about social process, of course, is increasing numbers of people. And what we're talking about in globalization is the increase of the global population from uh, uh, 1 million 10,000 years ago,
Hmm.
when we became a global species, or by the time we had become a global species, and up to now it's nearly 8 billion, and what demographers tell us is going to be now 11 billion in the second half of this century.
Hmm.
Even though the demographers are also telling us that uh, we're reaching a plateau, and of course, several parts of the world are now concerned about the decline in population growth and the fact that sex is now becoming unpopular and people aren't having children anymore. And the Japanese are worried that there'll be no Japanese left in a few generations.
Hmm.
Anyway, my point is that we talk about what it's like living in a society of a certain size. And especially we're concerned about the fact that urbanization is increasing, which means that we're all interacting with larger and larger numbers of people every day, even if we don't live in New York. And this makes the um, the quality of human life very different. So we began to um, become human in the way we are now in very small communities where we had to work out how to um, be able to depend upon people that we needed to work with in order to subsist.
Hmm.
And that, of course, has changed enormously as we've moved through several different stages of agricultural production and then industrialization and now the digital age. So my point is that what it means to be human or what it's like to live a social life is not something that, in order to understand, we need to study the individual, which is what medical practitioners tell us all the time. But we need to understand how the everyday life, the quality of everyday life changes um, as we interact, as our social processes expand, and we find ourselves interacting with larger and larger numbers of people, and needing to understand how to interact with larger and larger numbers of people, and that is probably going still now, even though it's changed enormously since the 19th century, it's still going to change much more by the end of this century. And this is the sort of thing that gets no discussion at all.
Right. That's an interesting observation because if you, and this is going to sound a little unusual, but the first thing that came to mind when you were discussing that was what happened in Europe when the Black Death, the bubonic plague hit. all economic, if you read studies, all economic activity decreased, plummeted off the board. Population sizes decreased by 15 to 20%. Social infrastructure was completely demolished. Urban areas weeded out. People returned to rural farmsteads to get away from other people to avoid transmission of the disease. And for several centuries, a blanket of, uh, of something. There are scholars who dispute that the Dark Ages were anything but dark, but nevertheless, it took centuries for economic and social life and infrastructure to return to the levels that it had been. So if that kind of retarding effect had happened as a result of a major outbreak of disease, your point on the other end of the spectrum as to what happens as the exponential growth keeps occurring is certainly very valid, and I think it doesn't get any attention.
I would say that it was a century and a half of very strange and very different social life after the Black Death, and then what happened after that? The Renaissance, the beginning of science, the beginning of our current academic curriculum.
Right, right.
So,
right. Which all might have happened 2 centuries earlier,
or might not have happened at all.
Might not have happened at all. That's possible. Yes, yes.
Because what the Black Death did was it destroyed the social structure, which kept the greater part of the population in a situation which left them with no hope.
Right, right.
And all of a sudden, since the rich died in numbers as large as the poor could go and grab the land that was vacated.
Right. That's true too.
I mean, I think similar things are happening now because all sorts of opportunities are beginning to develop for people who didn't have so many opportunities before. I mean, it's only really since the middle of the last century when everybody has had the hope of the same education.
So this is like the Black Death without mortality.
Yeah.
Without the morbidity aspect.
So one can only imagine, and of course, things have been happening in elections in the last few years that didn't happen before, because people who weren't making decisions for themselves earlier now are, and we have this problem in the current world of the inequality of knowledge and understanding between different types of people because of the social difference. And it's going to be very, well, one wonders whether we'll ever manage to put together or restructure society in such a way that everybody has the same level of awareness. And because that's, at the moment, we don't. And that's the biggest problem in modern society is the difference, not in income, which obviously is a problem still, but I think the biggest problem is the difference in levels of awareness.
Well, speaking of levels of awareness, there's been in my view in the past month or so, there's been a much greater emphasis on climate change in the news media and in awareness as a whole. And there are several new groups. One group in particular in Europe called the Extinction. There's something in their name called the Extinction Group, where they're.
Well, it's particularly interesting that Europe and London in particular is showing much more awareness of this than what one hears in this country.
Indeed, from the official circles, but I think that the level of awareness below the official circles, certainly in the circles that I inhabit, everybody's very aware of it, and not just the circles that I'm in, but nevertheless, this kind of global awareness, I think, with an extinction level event facing humanity, combined with the increasing level of awareness, I mean, this could be an interesting conflation of these two things.
Yes.
Because what will happen is that people have the ability to communicate across borders at will completely easily, and there's this species-threatening, if not planet-threatening kind of threat. It's a tailor-made solution, I think, for discussion and getting the word out amongst humanity as a whole, and maybe beginning to change the institutions to drive a change.
Yes, but I mean, I'm an optimist, maybe because of my membership of the International Big History Association and the idea of collective learning, that the larger the number of minds in contact with each other, the greater our intellectual ability and our ability to adapt and take care of environmental change. But in fact, what our social life is going to be like in these situations is something that is completely unknown, and for which it's very difficult for us to work out possible scenarios.
But isn't social life to some extent governed, as you just mentioned, on the culture, which in terms might be predicated upon the feeling of safety and security and real politic, if you will, as to the threats to daily life? I mean, if you're concerned about global warming and you're concerned about whether or not your home is going to be made uninhabitable by climate change, I mean, or your food supply is going to be changed dramatically. I mean, these are kinds of things that are going to affect the social life. Yes?
Well, the puzzle about social life in larger communities is that they never become culturally homogeneous.
Mm-hmm.
Some parts of them, they in fact are an amalgam of a lot of different smaller sub-communities. And
but like the Black Death, I mean, is climate change possibly something that would cut across all those heterogeneous communities?
Yes, but whether they'd all interact and work together in the same way is difficult to predict.
Mm-hmm. Even in face of a common threat.
Yeah, because it would be a different threat in different places.
That's disturbing.
So much depends upon the way the social configuration of an 11 billion global community develops.
So the 11 billion person global community will still continue to have these erratic spikes and valleys as we do today, in both awareness and also in responsiveness to various events and threats.
Yes, and since it takes 6 weeks for the Indians, the 900 million voting Indians, to have an election, how long is it going to take for a global community of 11 billion to work out how to manage themselves?
Yeah, there was an article today in the front page of the New York Times talking about the Indian government's response to a 120 mile an hour cyclone on the east coast of India, and how stunningly effective the government's evacuation procedures were in a very, very poor area where communication was at a very low level, and it was remarkable. I mean, the writer of the story had long, by the third paragraph, had long crossed the divide of objectivity, just talking in glowing terms about what the government had been able to pull off. And it was striking because it was such a poor area, with people presumably less connected to the communications infrastructure, that they were able to do this. Plus, I mean, the Indian government perhaps is not as well thought of as a model of efficiency. So it was interesting.
If they were efficient in coping with that, I wish they would be just as efficient in the way they deal with Pakistan.
Yeah, or conducting 6 weeks elections. So what? Just in a couple of headlines, what do you see an 11 billion person world looking like in terms of social infrastructure?
I think history will be very different. That it will not be a history of 193 nation states, but a history of cultural subcommunities that keep changing and keep moving around, dependent to some extent on the global economy, which is probably going to be very different as well. But it's going to be, we're going to be become accustomed to a life in which there is so much more diversity of behavior and expectations among the people that we interact with.
So more diffusion and granularization.
Those are good words to finish with.
Yeah. All right, Professor. Give me a lot to think about on that now. All right. Thank you very much. Look forward to talking to you next week. Thank you.
See you next week.